Alright, welcome to the Monster Crown trading card game version, like 5,000 or so. Alright, so we'll go over some of the fundamentals that have changed, starting with just the layout of the field. So here, obviously you have your deck area, pretty standard. Discard's going to be next to that. Then you're going to have your team zone. This is where all the monsters that you capture are going to go. Then you have your player zone. This is where your player will kind of go through his journey through the location cards, which we'll get to next. This is your journey deck. It's filled with your 15 location cards, and those are going to be played each of your turns in 5 slots that are going to be out here, and your player moves between those, encountering monsters, NPCs, everything like that. So a little example of gameplay. So at the start of your turn, you're going to draw a card from the top of your deck. It's a 50 card deck. And so every game, a player is going to have a 50 card main deck, a 15 card location deck or journey deck, a starter character, and a starting monster, of which you can only have one starter in your deck. Alright, so we draw a card, then the next thing that happens is we play a location card. Now, location cards have like a few abilities. For instance, there's ones that let you, like if it's a Flatlands monsters, that let you search your deck for a monster card that belongs to a Flatland and play it there. So whenever you have a monster that you can play in the applicable area, it goes into the wild above that slot. So as you can see, it kind of lines up nicely. You have your character, it's at the Flatlands, there's a monster in the Flatlands. So you can encounter it as such. So I could use my Ambigu, who, and if you look here, these little stats right here, 2, 3, and a 2, so this is attack, defense, speed, and they do exactly what you think they probably do. So let's say that I choose to attack this secret, who is a 1-1-3. That's going to work out. Let me get a dice for visual demonstration. I find it's the easiest way to keep track of damage. So I declare that I'm going to attack the secret. So secret has 3 speed, and so he's going to outspeed my Ambigu, who only has 2. So Ambigu takes 1 damage. Ambigu then deals 2 damage. Secret is beaten and added to the team. Easy mode. Just like that, you're collecting monsters, building up your team to make you able to beat larger monsters and your opponent. So, beating your opponent. What's that look like and what does it do? And, well, how do you win the game? So, once your location deck is empty, you lose the game. So you've noticed step 1, you're going to be playing a location card every turn. Well, if you have 5 location cards out and they're all face up, you don't have to play one. However, and going back to one little mistake here, to encounter something at any of these locations, you have to flip that location card face down, which makes it no longer usable. So let's say, going back, that this secret was over here on the far end. For some reason we have nothing in any of these other locations. During your turn, once per turn, you can move, you can just journey horizontally. And you can go through and you can have an encounter at every area that is applicable, that you have something at. Each one you got to flip back over, and you cannot journey across ones that are flipped over. So, for instance, if this was face down, my character can only go this far. On my next turn, I would have to play a location card from here to flip it, or play cards that allow you to flip locations over. So, alright. So, going back to damaging your opponents. Like I said, you're already kind of dwindling essentially your life source to play. And so how do you deal damage to your opponent's location deck? Well, whenever you and your opponent fight, which before you end your turn, there's a combat phase where you can choose to fight your opponent. Now, the person that attacks doesn't have the chance of, like, they don't actually lose life if they lose anything. The worst comes to worst is that some of their monsters are beaten, which beaten monsters are flipped face down and don't get to flip back face up until one of a few things happen, like you use a card that heals your monsters, or if your whole team is wiped, you're going to, go back to town, heal all your monsters back up, so they all get to come back over. So, going on the offense, the worst that could happen is that one of your, maybe some of your monsters are beaten and that carries over in your opponent's turn, which allows them to have a counterattack. So, if two players fight, um, you go through combat just the same as you would with a wild monster. The attacking player chooses a monster to lead with. The opposing player responds in kind, and it goes back and forth, comparing speed stats, attack and defense stats. You can swap out monsters. However, whenever you swap in a new monster, it can't attack that turn, and it takes 1 additional damage from attacks. And this is to prevent monsters from just doing a literal infinite cycling, and that +1 to damage continually increases. So if they swap a second time, 2 bonus damage, third time, 3 bonus damage, etc. So that way there can be benefits to switching, but it's not something that can just create a lock in a game. So let's say that my opponent only had their starter monster and Ambigu was just better than their starting monster and I just beat the hell out of them. So then they take damage to their location deck. So equal to the number of monsters that I still have active. So had 2 monsters active, they would take the top 2 cards of their location deck and place them face up right here next to it, and this is called your experience. So take damage from your location deck, it goes into your experience. Now, where this comes into play is, so let's go back to here, and I had encountered a few things, and a lot of my locations are spent. And normally, you're playing one every turn, so you can recoup slowly. However, taking damage, losing these battles doesn't just put you behind. Another negative aspect to losing combat is that you have to take your hand, place it on the bottom of your deck, draw 4 new cards at the end of that turn. So it kind of puts you behind in resources that way, kind of set you behind. But it can also be beneficial. You get a fresh hand. Sometimes if you have less than, if you have less than 4 cards, you might be like, you know what, I'll throw the fight, get a new hand. Who knows what your strategy might be. So, during your turn, after you play a location card, you can then play location cards from your experience into your location zone here. So I can take these 2 and play them here. So even though I took damage last turn, now I'm able to get off even more resources. These 2 in particular, these types of location cards would let me search for monsters and play them in the wild. So it gives me a lot of comeback potential and lets me build back up. So taking damage isn't just always the worst. It helps move the game along in both offense for both players, realistically. Let's see, so as far as types of cards, so we went over monsters, your character card. Your character card is there to just, do the journey. They'll all have abilities. Presently, how they work is once per turn, they typically have some kind of activation ability, like this character. Once per turn, I can give one of my monsters a +1 to speed, which can be super useful, and there's ones for different stats and all kinds of stuff. Location cards we obviously went over. They allow you to play monsters from your hand or based on their abilities that correlate to these locations. You also have Fate and Adventure cards, which here's a couple of good examples. So, Push Harder is a very classic Fate card. It just lets you get a +1 to any stat. So, and you can play these at any time. They're kind of like instant spells or something like that from Magic. They can be played at any time. They don't have any resource requirements or anything. You just throw them out there. So these come in very clutch. Next, you have Adventure cards. These can only be played on your turn and not like in response to anything. So they're like sorcery cards or different things like that. So you have ones that like Surprise Encounter. It lets you just play a monster from your hand into your wild, regardless of its location requirements. So, oh, you only have Woodlands out, but you have enough Feel in your hand? Okay, cool. Surprise Encounter. Play it. Then you have like Walking the Teeming Wilds, which lets you draw two and flip a location face up. So that way it kind of renews your resources and sets you ready to go. Um, so the game really, it has a lot of ways to build resources and continue to press itself and let both players be very engaged on their turn, and try to do a lot to build up to fight their opponent. Now, there are ways to deal extra damage as well. So there are boss monsters like Aphil, who I mentioned. So all boss monsters have a couple things automatically going for them. One, whenever they're in the wild, they get a +1 to every stat. So they are significantly more powerful than a lot of things out in the wild. They have a secondary ability that is whenever they're on your team, they count as an additional monster, as an additional active monster for the purpose of journey damage. So let's say that I had these 3 monsters still active when I beat my opponent. They're going to take 1, 2, 3, 4 damage instead of the typical just 3 that they would. So a lot of the boss monsters have interference effects like Trove and others that you play them on your opponent's side of the field and you try to trip them up and kind of set them behind, but it comes at a cost because if they're able to beat that monster and they add it to their team, it can be a bad day. They get that bonus damage and it does stack. So, and there's a lot of good counter cards to boss monsters as well as the fact that they're just hard to capture. So I guess some more subtle nuances of the game. So type advantage. What would a monster taming game with a type advantage mechanic be if it wasn't included? So in this it's pretty simple. Whenever 2 monsters fight, if one of them has type advantage, that player gets to draw a card. That keeps it from being like, if somebody just runs like all unstable monsters, they will automatically beat a team with all relentless monsters. Like, that just doesn't happen. But playing it, in a smart way, they can get a lot of draw power. Having a good type wheelhouse in your deck allows you to go through the wild and play smartly and get to draw a lot of extra cards. And as anyone that's played a trading card game knows, hand power typically equals wins. So those are the fundamentals of the game. Other than just some like nitty-gritty details, which feel free to ask about, that's pretty much how the game plays. You're collecting monsters from the wilds to encounter things in the wild. You flip cards, and that space becomes barren, so you can't journey to it. I forgot one type of card. NPCs. So NPCs are also played in the wild. However, they don't go away like monsters do. You still flip the location to encounter them, but they'll have abilities like, for instance, the Grinning Shopkeeper lets you look at the top 3 cards of your deck, and then you can draw one and put the others on the top or bottom of your deck in any order. So if you have like 2 of those here in the center, you can like encounter a monster, do that twice, encounter monsters. You can just get this sweeping chain of events going off in your turn. They can make your turns feel very powerful if you plan them accordingly. And there's something similar to, I guess, summoning sicknesses, what it's called in Magic. There's a few other terms for it in other games. But whenever a monster is first played into a wild spot, it cannot be encountered that turn. So that way the game kind of keeps a pace, and people don't just flood each other very quickly. You can also, so you can stack any number of cards in a wild. Like, you can have 3 NPCs and 4 monsters right here, but you can still only encounter one thing at a time here. So it's better to have them spread out, because then once this is flipped, well, it doesn't matter that there's like 5 cards here. You only got the 1 out of it. So it's better to have a more full journey area, and that way you can get those nice sweeping turns with a lot of actions. So yeah, like I said, draw a card, play location card, play monsters and NPCs into your wild, then you journey And you only get to move once, so you just kind of get to pick which direction you go in, and then you go until you have to stop, either because you just run out of space or because there's nothing there or it's flipped. Yep, so add monsters to your team, journey, and then optionally attack your opponent and deplete their location deck to win the game. And that is all for the Monster Crown trading card game. If you have any questions, I will be very happy to answer them. Thank you.